You've found the Stealth Podcast. Where are you watching from? What time is it there? Subscribe and comment to support us. Thanks. Let's begin. My name is Darren Alcott. I'm 34 years old, and I live out a 1998 Ford 350 that I converted myself over the course of 8 months in my brother's garage in Missoula. I stripped the whole thing down to the metal walls, insulated it with spray foam, built a sleeping platform with storage underneath, and mounted a small propane stove near the side door. It's not pretty, but it's mine. I've been living in it full-time for about 2 years now, picking up remote land surveying contracts and moving between jobs whenever something better comes up. Most people think it sounds lonely. Honestly, most of the time, it isn't. The other two people in this story don't live in vans. Petra Solis, 38, is a wildlife photographer from Billings who I met at a fuel station outside of Bozeman about 6 months before any of this happened. She drove a beat-up Subaru Outback loaded with camera gear and had this way of talking about light. Golden hour, blue hour, the exact angle of the sun in late October. Like it was something personal between her and the sky. We started running into each other at trailheads and eventually just started coordinating. Not romantic, just practical. 2 people traveling solo is safer than 1, and she knew locations I'd never find on a map. The third person was Petra's younger cousin, Tomas Solis, 26, who had driven up from Tucson with a week off work and absolutely zero camping experience. He showed up with a brand new sleeping bag still in the packaging and a Bluetooth speaker he kept threatening to play cumbia from. He was funny in that way, where you're laughing even when you don't want to be, and he asked about 100 questions a day. Why does the van smell like propane? What do you do if a bear comes? Do you ever just lose your mind out here? He was the kind of person who makes a trip feel lighter just by being in it. We were headed to the Beartooth highway corridor, but not the part everyone photographs. Petra had a location, a fire lookout access road off Highway 212 near the Wyoming border, about 40 minutes past Cook City. She'd been there once before in summer and said the plateau views were unlike anything she'd shot. We were going in mid-September, which meant the crowds were gone, the aspens were turning, and the temperature was going to drop hard at night. The plan was simple. Drive up, park somewhere flat off the main road, spend 2 nights, let Petra work the light at dawn, and head back before the weekend. I packed extra firewood because Tomas had complained about the cold approximately 4 times before we even left the Cook City gas station. Petra reviewed her gear checklist in the passenger seat while Tomas sat in the back of the van on the sleeping platform, eating trail mixed directly from the bag and asking if we'd get cell service. We wouldn't. The last bar had disappeared somewhere around the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness boundary marker, and I'd watched it go like watching a light switch off. I didn't think much of it at the time. I'd worked plenty of jobs in dead zones. No signal just meant quiet. The road we turned onto wasn't marked with anything official. Petra had GPS coordinates written in her field notebook, cross-referenced with a Forest Service map she'd printed at a library in Red Lodge. The road was dirt and rock, wide enough for 1 vehicle, with lodgepole pine pressing in close on both sides. The van's suspension complained every few hundred feet. Tomas braced himself against the wall and said something about how his chiropractor was going to love this, and I told him he was 26 and didn't have a chiropractor, and he said that's exactly how you end up needing one. We found the clearing around 6:40 in the evening. It was a wide, flat shelf of land, maybe the size of a basketball court, edged on the far side by a tree line and opening on the south face to a full view of the plateau dropping away below us. The sky was doing something extraordinary. Long orange light cutting sideways through a band of clouds, the kind of thing Petra immediately got out of the car for, camera in hand before she'd even said a word. I parked the van parallel to the trees, killed the engine, and sat for a second just listening. Wind, birds, the tick of the engine cooling. Tomas climbed out and stood in the middle of the clearing with his arms out like he was presenting the place to someone. Okay, he said. Okay, I get it now. And I knew what he meant. There's a version of Montana that doesn't look real, too wide, too open, too much sky. And this clearing was sitting right in the middle of it. I got out and started setting up the cooking area near the side door of the van, stacking the firewood against the rear bumper. Everything felt clean. The air smelled like pine resin and cold stone and the faint sweetness of something I couldn't name. Petra shot for about 40 minutes, moving around the edge of the clearing with that quiet intensity she had, barely speaking. Tomas tried to help me start the camp stove and managed to ignite it on the third attempt, which he celebrated like he'd personally invented fire. We made chili from a pouch and ate standing up because the folding chairs were buried under Petra's gear bags. The temperature dropped fast once the sun cleared the ridgeline. I remember thinking as I washed the bowls out with a water bottle and a rag that this was the best kind of night, the kind that starts exactly the way you planned it. We sat around a small fire I'd built about 10 feet from a van, close enough to feel the heat off the side panel. Tomas had finally gotten the Bluetooth speaker out and was playing something low and instrumental, not cumbia, which I chose to be grateful for. Petra was reviewing shots on the back of her camera, holding it at an angle to avoid the firelight glare, occasionally making a small sound of either approval or frustration. I was drinking coffee from a thermos and half watching the tree line. Not for any particular reason. It's just what I do at night in new places. I take stock of the edges. The tree line was maybe 30 feet from the van on the north side. Dense lodgepole pine, the kind that grows tight and vertical and doesn't leave much space between trunks. In daylight, it had looked like a wall of bark and shadow. Now, with just the fire going, it was fully black, the kind of dark that a flashlight only makes a small dent in. I wasn't thinking about it consciously. I just noticed it the way you notice the edge of a roof when you're standing near it. Around 9:30, Tomas said he thought he heard something in the trees. He said it the way a 26-year-old says most things, casually, half a statement, half a question, checking to see if he should be more serious about it. Petra looked up from her camera and said it was probably a deer. I agreed because it probably was. The Beartooth area has elk and mule deer moving through at dusk, and a deer walking through dry pine needles sounds bigger than it is. I told Tomas that, and he nodded, but he turned the speaker volume down without being asked, and I noticed that. What we heard over the next hour wasn't dramatic. That's the thing I keep coming back to when I try to explain it to people. There was no single moment where I thought, okay, something is wrong. It was more like a slow accumulation of small things that didn't individually mean anything but started adding up the way an unpaid bill adds up, quietly then suddenly. A branch broke somewhere deep in the trees, the kind of crack that comes from weight and not wind. Then nothing for a while. Then I thought I caught a smell, something faintly organic like wet fur or standing water, but the wind direction kept shifting and I couldn't hold on to it. Petra put her camera away around 10. She did it deliberately, not rushed, but there was something in the movement that felt like a decision. She zipped the case, set it inside the van, and came back to the fire and sat down close enough that our shoulders almost touched. She didn't say anything. I looked at her once, and she gave me this flat, steady look that meant she was paying attention to something. Petra wasn't the type to panic or announce concern. She was the type to get quiet and focused, and she was doing that now. Tomas had stopped talking, which for him was significant. He was sitting with his knees pulled up, poking at the fire with a long stick, watching the coals. He asked, without looking up, how far the nearest other campsite was. I told him probably 12 miles back toward Cook City. He nodded and poked the fire again. The instrumental music had stopped, and no one restarted it. The quiet that replaced it felt different from the quiet we'd arrived to. Heavier, more present, like something filling a space that should have been empty. I got up and did a slow walk around the van. I told him I was checking the tire I thought might be losing pressure, which was partially true. I had noticed it felt soft on the drive up, but I also just wanted to look. I took my flashlight and walked the perimeter of the clearing, not fast, not tense, just deliberate. The south face was open and still beautiful under a half moon. The east edge where the road came in was quiet. The north tree line I lit up in sections, moving the beams slowly. Lodgepole trunks, brush, the occasional white face of a birch. Nothing out of place, nothing moving, except, and I've thought about this a lot since, the smell hit me again when I was on the north side, stronger this time. Not threatening in itself, just present, like something had been there recently and left a trace. I moved the flashlight beam along the ground at the tree line and saw what I thought was a boot print in the soft dirt at the edge of the clearing. Partial, half inside the grass, hard to be sure. I stood there for a second and looked at it. Then I told myself it could be mine from when I'd grabbed firewood, which I had done earlier in roughly that spot, and walked back to the fire. I didn't tell Petra or Tomas about the print. Looking back, I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe because I wasn't sure enough to say it out loud. Maybe because saying it out loud would have changed the whole texture of the night, and I wasn't ready to do that yet. Instead, I topped off the fire, told them I was going to turn in, and suggested we all do the same. Petra agreed immediately. Tomas lingered another minute, looking at the tree line once more with that long stick-in-hand stillness, then followed us in without a word. I slept in the front cab reclined, the way I always do when I have people in the back. Petra had the sleeping platform. Tomas had a camping pad on the floor between the platform and the side door. I'd run the roof vent open about 2 inches, enough to circulate air without letting in cold, and I could hear their breathing settle within about 20 minutes. Good. That meant they weren't lying awake thinking about anything. I was, though. Not in a loud way. I wasn't running scenarios or gripping anything. Just that kind of thin, alert half-sleep where your body is resting, but some part of you stays switched on. I've had it before on remote job sites where something about the location just keeps one ear open all night. I know what it feels like, and I know it doesn't always mean anything. I closed my eyes and focused on the sound of the wind coming through the vent. Somewhere around 2 a.m. I woke up fully. Not from sound, I didn't hear anything. I just opened my eyes and was completely awake, the way you are when your body decides the rest is done. I lay still for a moment, listening. Wind faint. Tomas breathing a little heavy on the floor. The van creaking once with temperature. I tilted my head and looked out through the side window from the cab. The clearing was lit by moonlight, flat and silver and completely empty. Then I saw the light. It was on the far south edge of the clearing, near where the plateau dropped away. A small light, white, moving slowly. Not a flashlight. The beam was too diffuse for that. More like a phone screen or a headlamp on its lowest setting. It moved in a slow, deliberate arc, maybe 4 feet left, then 4 feet right, then it stopped. I watched it for a full minute without moving. It didn't go out. It just held there, pointed slightly downward like someone standing at the edge looking at the ground. My first thought was another camper. Someone who'd parked lower on the road and hiked up. Not impossible. The second thought, which arrived almost immediately, was that the road below us was single track and I'd have heard a vehicle on the approach. I've been a light sleeper all night. Nothing had come up that road. I sat up slowly, keeping my head below the window line out of instinct more than logic, and I sat there in the dark thinking. I reached back and touched Petra's arm. She came awake immediately, not startled, just present, the way she always did. I didn't say anything. I just turned my head toward the south window, and she followed the direction. A few seconds passed. Then I heard her exhale slowly through her nose. She'd seen it. I leaned over and touched Tomas and felt him flinch hard, so I put my hand over his mouth before he made a sound. His eyes went wide, and I shook my head once. He got it. He went completely still. The three of us sat in that dark van watching the light. It made one more slow pass, left, right, then went out entirely. The south edge of the clearing was just moonlight again. Petra put her hand on my arm and held it there. I could feel Tomas behind me, not moving, barely breathing. We stayed like that for a long time. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 15, long enough that my neck started to ache from the angle. The clearing stayed empty. The tree line stayed dark. Nothing moved. I eventually sat back and let out a breath and tried to think through it. Hiker with a headlamp. Someone checking their campsite below us. A ranger doing a late pass. They did that sometimes in the Beartooth corridor, especially near the highway boundary. Any of those was reasonable. I was aware as I thought all this that I was building a scaffold of reasonable explanations very deliberately, and that said something about how I was actually feeling underneath it. I told myself we'd wait until light and then look at the edge of the plateau, see if there were tracks, a tent, any sign of someone. I told myself that out loud, quietly, to Petra and Tomas, and both of them nodded. Nobody went back to sleep. Dawn came in slow. By 5:30, there was enough gray light to see the whole clearing without a flashlight, and by 6 the sun was touching the top edge of the tree line. Nobody had talked about leaving yet, but I could feel in the way Tomas was already moving, quietly repacking things that didn't need repacking, stacking his bag near the side door, checking his phone for a signal it wasn't going to find. Petra was outside with her camera, working the morning light like she'd promised herself she would. She was professional that way. She didn't let one bad night cancel what she'd come to do. I walked the south edge of the clearing before she finished her first set of shots. It took me about 3 minutes to reach the drop-off from where the van was parked. The ground there was a mix of thin alpine grass and exposed pale soil, and the soil held marks well. I found 2 boot prints side by side, facing the drop-off like someone standing and looking down. Deep heel impressions, larger than my foot by at least a size. The prints came from the east. I could trace 4 or 5 partial impressions leading in from that direction, and they didn't go back the same way. They just stopped at the edge. I looked down the slope and saw nothing but open plateau falling away into the valley. I didn't call Petra over. I took a photo with my phone and went back to the van and thought about it over coffee. The prints didn't have to mean anything aggressive. People hike at night in the Beartooth, astronomers, hunters, people who just like it. But they've been close. They've been watching the clearing from the south while we were awake and visible and lit up by our own fire earlier in the night. That felt different from a casual night hike. That felt like someone who knew where we were. Petra finished shooting around 7:30 and came back to the van. I showed her the photo on my phone. She studied it for a long time. "One person," she said. I nodded. She handed the phone back and looked toward the east tree line. "They came from that direction," I said. She said, "I know." We looked at each other and had one of those conversations that happen entirely without words. The kind where 2 people who've spent enough time in remote places together just assess risk the same way and arrive at the same place at the same time. We'd stay through the morning. Petra would finish her shot list. We'd leave by early afternoon, before dark. Tomas hadn't slept, and it was showing. He was sitting in the open side door of the van with a cup of instant coffee, saying almost nothing, which was so foreign to his baseline that it felt like a symptom. I asked him if he was all right, and he said he was fine. Then he said, "I keep thinking about that light," and I said, "Yeah." And he said like someone was just standing there, not coming toward us, not leaving, just standing there. I told him we didn't know what it meant and that we'd be on the road by noon. He nodded and drank his coffee and stared at the east tree line like he was expecting something to walk out of it. Nothing did. The morning was quiet and clean, the kind of September morning in Montana that earns the state its reputation. Cold enough to see your breath, warm enough in the sun to unzip your jacket, the aspen gold visible in patches on the lower slopes. Petra got what she came for. I watched her work and tried to stay in that, try to let the beauty of the place be what it was without dragging the night into it. I mostly succeeded. Tomas eventually relaxed enough to eat 2 granola bars and make a joke about how he was going to sleep for 4 days when he got back to Tucson. We started packing around 10. I was loading the last of the firewood into the van when I found the object at the rear bumper. It was sitting on top of the wood stack, placed there deliberately. That much was obvious because it couldn't have blown in or fallen from anywhere. It was a small animal vertebra, bleached white, and around it someone had wrapped a length of wire with 2 small animal teeth threaded onto it, like a crude bracelet. It was sitting centered on the top piece of firewood, like it had been arranged, like it was meant to be found. I stood there holding it for longer than I should have. My brain kept cycling through the options. Left over from a previous camper, natural debris arranged by coincidence, a joke from Tomas. But Tomas was 10 feet away helping Petra break down a tripod and hadn't been near the van's rear in 20 minutes. And the firewood had been stacked chest-high the night before. Whatever this was, it had been placed there while we slept. Within reach of the van. Within reach of us. I put the vertebra in my jacket pocket without showing either of them. I finished loading the firewood and closed the rear doors and walked to the driver's door and unlocked the van. "Let's get going," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. And Petra looked at me from across the clearing with that flat, reading look, and I met it, and something passed between us that neither of us named. She picked up her camera bag and walked toward the van without another word. The drive out started fine. The dirt road was bumpy going back down, the same as coming up, and for about the first 10 minutes, I let myself believe we were just leaving, Just 3 people with a successful, if weird, camping trip behind them, headed back toward Cook City and eventually a diner and cell service, and the complete normalcy of other people. Tomas was quieter than usual, but he'd found a bag of chips somewhere and was eating them, and that felt like recovery. Petra had her notebook out and was writing in it, which she did after every shoot. I noticed the truck about 4 minutes down the road. It was parked on the right shoulder, partially behind a stand of pines, facing uphill, meaning it was pointed directly at the road we'd come down. Dark green, older, a full-size pickup with a camper shell on the bed. No plates visible from my angle. No one in the cab that I could see. I slowed without stopping, passing it at about 10 miles per hour, and I took in what I could. The truck was clean for something sitting on a dirt road. No accumulation of dust on the hood the way you get when a vehicle's been sitting through the night in dry conditions. It had arrived recently. I didn't say anything to Petra or Tomas. I picked up speed once I was past it and watched the rear view. The truck didn't move. It just sat there behind us, half hidden by the pines as we put distance between it and us. My mind went to the boot prints, the size, the deliberate placement at the edge. Someone who'd hiked up from below us, watched our camp, arranged something in our bumper, and then come back down before dawn. The truck felt like confirmation of a sentence I hadn't wanted to finish. Petra had closed her notebook. I hadn't said a word and she'd felt it. The change in the way I was driving, maybe, or just that awareness she had. She turned around and looked back down the road through the rear window. She turned back forward without speaking. Then she said, quietly so Tomas couldn't hear over the road noise, "Green truck?" I said yes. She said, "It wasn't there when we came up yesterday." I said, "I know." She nodded once and faced forward and said nothing else. We hit the highway in about 20 minutes. Pavement felt like safety. I know that's irrational, but it's what it felt like, the transition from dirt to asphalt, the opening up of sight lines on both sides, the feeling of speed becoming available again. Tomas let out a long breath and said, okay, 3 times like he was reassuring himself. I pushed us up to 65 and headed west toward Cook City. Nobody talked for a while. The mountains were enormous on both sides. The sky was absolutely clear. I checked the rear view every 30 seconds for the first 5 miles. No green truck, just empty highway and rock and sky. After 10 miles, I let myself slow down internally, let the grip in my shoulders ease a little. We stopped at the Cook City General Store because Tomas needed a bathroom and Petra wanted to ask about the fire lookout access, whether anyone had been up that road recently. The woman working the counter said she didn't know of anyone with a permit for that area that weekend. She said it with a mild disinterest of someone answering a question she got a version of all the time. I was at the van when I took the vertebra out of my jacket pocket. I stood there with it in my palm, looking at it. The wire, the teeth, the bleached bone. It wasn't a thread exactly, or at least it wasn't anything I could take to a ranger station and say, "Look, someone left this." I took a photo of it and then set it on the concrete curb by the gas pump and left it there. I didn't want it in the van. I don't know why exactly. It just felt like the right thing to do, like putting something back that shouldn't have traveled with me. Petra came out of the store with 2 bottles of water and saw me standing by the pump and looked at the thing on the curb. She didn't ask. She handed me a water and we stood there for a second. Tomas came out of the bathroom, pulling his jacket on, and stopped when he saw our expressions. "What is that?" he said, looking at the curb. I told him we'd found it at the campsite. He crouched down and looked at it without touching it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up and said, "Someone was in our camp while we were sleeping," and the way he said it, flat, not a question, told me he'd already worked through that possibility on his own, probably sometime around 3 a.m. when none of us were talking. We got back on the highway. I drove the whole way to Red Lodge without stopping, 3 hours of mountain road with the cruise control set and the windows cracked, and all 3 of us mostly quiet in our own separate versions of thinking it through. Red Lodge came into view in the late afternoon, and I pulled into a diner parking lot and turned off the engine, and we just sat there for a minute. "You think they were in the area and just curious?" Tomas said. Petra said, "No." He looked at her. She said, "Curious people don't leave things." I didn't disagree. I still have the photo of that vertebra on my phone. I've looked at it maybe 100 times, tried to read something in it, a message, an accident, anything that would make it make sense. I've driven out to the Beartooth twice since, different spots, different months, and both times I've sat in the cab before bed and scanned the tree line and thought about the fact that out here, in a wide open country that looks like it's completely empty, there is sometimes someone in it who knows exactly where you are, who came close enough to touch your things, and who walked away before you ever saw their face. That's the part that stays with me. Not that they were there, that I never found out why. My name is Sylvia Crane. I'm 47 years old, and I live out of a converted Chevy Express cargo van that I've been driving up and down the western half of this country for the last 3 years. Before the van, I had a 2-bedroom apartment in Portland, a job doing medical billing for an orthopedic clinic, and a marriage that ended quietly and without much drama, which somehow made it worse than if it had ended loud. I sold most of what I owned, kept my books, my cast iron pan, and my mother's old blanket, and left. The van has a bed, a small inverter, a water jug, and a crate I use as both a pantry and a step stool. I am not a minimalist by philosophy. I just ran out of reasons to keep accumulating. The person with me for this particular stretch was my friend Deb Okafor, 52, who taught high school chemistry in Spokane and took her summers completely off in a way that I genuinely admired. Deb didn't live in a van. She had a house, a garden, a cat named Ptolemy. But every summer she'd pick a region and ask if she could tag along for 2 or 3 weeks. And she was good company in the specific way that matters on a long drive. She didn't need to fill every silence. She contributed to fuel costs without being asked, and she had strong opinions about gas station food that were almost always correct. She'd been on 3 trips with me before this one. She knew the rhythms. We were working our way through the northwestern corner of Montana, which doesn't get nearly the attention that Glacier does, but is quietly one of the most remote stretches of land in the lower 48. The plan was loose: drive the Bull Lake Road corridor south of Troy, find a pull-off near the Cabinet Mountains wilderness boundary, spend a few nights, and let Deb do the hiking she'd been talking about since March. I'd work remotely where I had signal and read when I didn't. Simple. The kind of trip I'd done 30 times without incident. The Bull Lake area sits in a long river valley hemmed in by the Cabinet Mountains to the east and a series of forested ridges to the west. The lake itself is about 7 miles long, dark and deep and cold even in August, fed by snowmelt coming down through old-growth timber. There's a small community, a gas station, a boat ramp, a few scattered houses set back in the trees, and then the road narrows and the population disappears, and it's just water and forest and the occasional logging truck coming around a blind curve faster than you'd like. I'd pulled up the area on a Forest Service map 2 days before and found a dispersed camping area near the south end of the lake, off a gravel spur that looked flat and accessible. No reviews, no photos, just coordinates and the words "primitive site" in small text. We arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late July. The gravel spur was exactly where the map said it would be, easy to miss from the main road, just a gap in the tree line with 2 tire tracks pressed into the grass. I pulled in slowly, the van rocking over a shallow drainage ditch, and followed the tracks about 100 yards into the trees before they opened up onto a small clearing with a fire ring made of stacked river stones and a view straight down to the lake through a break in the willows. The water was absolutely still, dark blue going on black, the kind of surface that reflects the sky so perfectly it looks like you could step onto it. Deb got out and stood at the willow break with her hands on her hips and said, "Okay, Sylvia, okay," which was her version of being impressed. I backed the van so the sliding door faced the lake and cut the engine and sat for a second with the window down, listening. Water moving somewhere nearby, a small creek or inlet, wind in the tops of the firs. Nothing else. I checked the ground clearance around the site, force of habit, making sure I wasn't parked over anything that would cause a problem at 2 a.m., and then I got out and started setting up. We made dinner while the sun dropped behind the western ridge. Pasta with olive oil and the last of a jar of sun-dried tomatoes I'd been rationing since Missoula. Deb had brought a bottle of red, wine she'd been transporting upright in her hiking pack since Spokane, which she considered a significant achievement, and we drank it from tin cups while the lake went from blue to silver to a flat, lightless black. The fire ring was good. Whoever had built it knew what they were doing, deep and well-drafted, and the wood we'd brought from a bundle I'd bought in Troy caught fast and burned clean. We talked about her students, about my billing work, about a podcast we'd both been listening to about cold cases in the Pacific Northwest. Normal things, the kind of conversation that feels like settling in. At some point, Deb said she wanted to try to get up at 5 for the morning hike she'd been planning, the one up to the ridgeline above the lake, and I told her I'd have coffee ready. She refilled her cup and looked out at the water and said it was eerie how still it was. I looked out at it too. She was right. The lake wasn't moving at all, not a ripple, not a surface disturbance, and in the firelight it looked less like water than like a hole in the ground. I laughed at that and told her she'd been listening to too many cold case podcasts, and she agreed, and we went to bed around 10. I pulled the curtains across the side windows and the windshield and lay on my bed with the wool blanket pulled up and listened to the lake and the fire dying down outside and felt, as I usually did in new places, the particular peace of having parked somewhere good. It lasted until about 3 in the morning, which is when Deb shook me awake and said, in a voice that was very carefully controlled, "There's a boat on the lake, and it's not moving." I sat up and looked through the gap in the curtain over the sliding door window. Deb was right. About 60 yards out on the water, there was a small boat, aluminum flat bottom, the kind people use for fishing on mountain lakes, sitting completely still. No running lights, no sound of a motor, just the shape of it sitting on that black water in the moonlight, the silhouette of one person in it, facing our direction. The figure wasn't doing anything, not fishing, no rod visible, no motion, not paddling, just sitting in a stationary boat in the middle of the night, facing the shore, facing us. I watched for a full 2 minutes, and the boat didn't drift, which meant either the water was completely dead calm, which it was, or whoever was in it was maintaining position deliberately. Both possibilities had the same effect on me, which was a cold, careful alertness that started in my chest and spread outward. "Could be fishing," I said, and Deb said, at 3 a.m., no lights facing shore, and I didn't have a good response to that. I let the curtain fall and sat back on the bed and tried to think through it practically. The lake had a boat ramp. Local fishermen did sometimes go out at night. Certain fish feed better in low light and cold water, and late July nights in Montana were short and cool. It wasn't impossible. It was also not the way any fisherman I'd ever seen behaved. You face the water. You face your line. You don't sit motionless facing the shore of a campsite. Deb sat down on the bed next to me, and we talked about it in low voices, not because anyone could hear us through the van walls, but because that's what the situation called for. She was handling it the way she handled everything, analytically, methodically, working through the variables. She said the figure had been there when she woke up to use the bathroom at 2:45, which meant it had been there at least 15 minutes, maybe longer. She hadn't been able to tell if it was a man or a woman. The figure was sitting straight-backed, hands in lap, which was what had stopped her cold in the first place. Not slumped over a rod, just sitting upright, looking toward shore. I turned on my phone screen, no signal but the brightness, and covered it with my hand so it wouldn't light up the windows, and checked the time. 3:08. I set the phone face down and looked at the ceiling of the van for a second and made a decision. Not about leaving. Leaving on that road in the dark felt worse than staying, and we didn't know there was an actual threat. The decision was that I was going to stay awake until dawn. I told Deb that, and she said she already planned to. I reached under the driver's seat and wrapped my hand around the handle of the tire iron I kept there. Not pulling it out, just making contact. We sat in the dark van and watched through the curtain gap in shifts, one of us looking while the other sat back. The boat didn't move for the rest of the night. Not a drift, not a turn, not a change in the figure's posture. It was out there when the stars were still thick, and it was out there when the sky started to gray in the east, and when there was enough dawn light to see clearly. The boat was empty. Just an aluminum flat bottom sitting on the water with no one in it. I stared at that empty boat for a long time. The lake was still. There was no sound of anyone on shore, no splashing, no footsteps. Whoever had been in it was simply gone. Deb made coffee on the camp stove outside at first light. She said she needed air, and I understood that. I stood in the sliding door and watched the lake and the empty boat and the willow break and drank coffee and felt the kind of tired that isn't about sleep. She came and stood next to me, and we looked at it together. "Could have tipped," she said, not like she believed it. I said, "No splash, no sound." She said, "No." We were quiet for a while. A merganser flew low across the water and landed near the empty boat, and nothing happened, and that felt almost worse, the bird just going about their morning in the presence of that thing. The boat had drifted about 15 feet south by 7 a.m., so the water had some current after all, or the wind had picked up slightly. Close enough now that I could see details. Old green paint on the hull, a wood plank seat, an anchor rope coiled in the bow. No motor, no oars visible. The anchor hadn't been dropped, which meant the figure last night had been holding position manually. Hands in water, maybe, or just very slight paddle strokes too small to see from shore. Doing it quietly, doing it deliberately. Deb had planned her ridge hike for today, and I watched her think about whether she was still going. That internal negotiation played out on her face for about 10 minutes. The practical part of her arguing that no actual threat had materialized, the sensible part of her arguing that she was not going to walk alone into the woods above a lake, where someone had spent the night silently watching her campsite. The sensible part one. She said she'd hike the road south toward the boat ramp instead. Stay in the open, be back in 2 hours. I said fine, stay on the road, take the emergency whistle off my pack, and she took it without arguing, which told me she'd already been thinking about it. I stayed with the van and watched the lake. Around 8:30 a.m., truck pulled into the boat ramp down the shore. I could see it through the willows, about a quarter mile away. Someone getting an early start on the water. They launched a kayak, paddled north, and never came near our sight. Normal. A completely normal Tuesday morning in July, except for the empty aluminum boat that was still sitting out there on the flat black water, not belonging to anyone, pointing nowhere. Deb got back around 10:30, earlier than she'd said. She came down the spur road at a pace that wasn't quite a run, but had the energy of one. And when she got to the van, she took 3 seconds to catch her breath before she told me. About a mile south of our spur, where the road ran close to the lakeshore, there was a small wooden dock, private, no trespassing sign, attached to a house set back in the trees about 100 yards. The house was old, curtains drawn, one vehicle in the dirt driveway, a white sedan with a cracked windshield. Normal enough, except that on the dock there was a man sitting in a chair, and he was watching her walk the road. He didn't move or speak, just watched her all the way from when she came into his line of sight until the road bent and she lost sight of him. "Probably just a guy on his dock," I said, and she said, "Sylvia, he had binoculars." I sat with that for a second. She said the binoculars were raised, aimed at her, not at the water. He wasn't bird watching. He was watching her, specifically a single woman walking a road, and he'd maintained that watch the entire time she was visible. She wasn't shaken easily. Deb had been on trail solo for years, had dealt with aggressive men before, had a blunt practicality about threat assessment that I trusted. And right now, she was shaken. I thought about the boat. The dock was about a quarter mile south of us, which meant whoever owned that house also owned the most obvious launching point for a small aluminum flat bottom. I didn't say that out loud right away. I poured Deb more coffee and told her to sit down for a minute. She sat on the running board and held her cup in both hands and stared at the ground between her boots, and I could see her running it the same way I was running it, assembling the sequence. The boat, the figure, the binoculars, the proximity, the hours. We started packing. Not frantically. Nothing about our behavior would signal anything to anyone watching from a distance, but steadily and with intention. I broke down the camp stove and stowed it. Deb rolled her sleeping bag and compressed it. We worked efficiently and quietly, and at some point she said, "Did anyone know we were going to be at this specific spot?" And I said, no one. We told no one. The dispersed site wasn't registered. No fee, no permit, no record of us being there. Which meant that if someone had found us, they'd either followed us in from the main road, and I had not seen another vehicle on the spur when we'd arrived, or they'd been watching the spur road and seen us pull in. I wanted to check if the boat was still out on the water before we left. I wanted to look at it once more. It was gone. In the 20 minutes we'd been packing, the boat had disappeared from the lake entirely. The water was empty. I stood at the willow break and scanned the whole visible surface, and there was nothing out there. No boat, no person, no disturbance. It had either been retrieved from the dock end, which would have put whoever moved it close enough to our sight to hear us packing, or it had drifted around the southern bend and out of sight. Either way, something had changed. The boat being out there all night had been passive. The boat disappearing while we packed felt like a response. I went back to the van and told Deb, and her expression shifted into something careful and focused. She asked how long I thought it would take to reach the main road. I said 4 minutes, maybe 5 over the drainage ditch. She said okay, and picked up her pack and climbed in the passenger seat, and I got in the driver's side and started the van. The engine turned over on the first try. I remember being grateful for that in a way that felt disproportionate, and I put in reverse and started backing down the tire track toward the spur road entrance. I was going slow, watching the rearview mirror for the gap in the trees that marked where the spur met the main road, when Deb said, "Stop." I stopped. She was looking at the side mirror on her door. I looked at mine. At the south end of the clearing, near the willow break, a man was standing. He was watching the van. He was maybe 40 feet away, close enough to see clearly, far enough that he could claim he'd just wandered in from the shore. He was wearing dark pants and a heavy canvas jacket, gray or brown, and he had his hands in his pockets. He wasn't doing anything. He was just standing there in the middle of the clearing we'd been camped in, watching us leave. I held the brake for 3 full seconds and looked at him in a mirror. He didn't move, didn't raise a hand, didn't speak, didn't step back. Just stood there with his hands in his pockets like he was waiting for something to finish. I couldn't see his face clearly at that distance. The morning light was behind him, putting him slightly in silhouette, but his posture had a quality I can only describe as patient, like someone who had been waiting and was simply watching the waiting come to an end. I released the brake and kept reversing slowly, steadily, not fast enough to bog down in the soft ground by the drainage ditch. I watched him in the mirror the entire way. He didn't follow. He didn't move at all. He stayed exactly where he was as the tree line closed between us, and when I reached the main road and turned out onto the gravel. The last thing I saw in the mirror was the clearing empty again, the willows along the lake edge, and the water behind them flat and dark and giving nothing back. We didn't speak for the first 5 miles. I drove north on the Bull Lake Road, and Deb sat with her pack on her lap. She hadn't put in a back, just kept it on her lap, and stared through the windshield. The road was narrow, and the trees were close on both sides, and I drove faster than I should have on a gravel surface. Not dangerously, but enough that the van rocked, and Deb put one hand on the door handle to steady herself and didn't complain about it. When we hit the paved county road, she finally exhaled and set the pack in the footwell and said, "I want to find a ranger station." I said there was a Lincoln County Sheriff's substation in Troy, about 20 minutes north, and she said that would do. I didn't argue. I wasn't sure what we'd report. A man standing in a legal dispersed camping area, a boat with no one in it, binoculars on a dock. But I understood why she wanted to talk to someone official. It had nothing to do with whether they could help, and everything to do with needing to say it out loud to a person with a badge who would write it down. The Troy substation was a small brown building on the main drag with 2 patrol vehicles in the lot and a hand-painted hour sign in the window. We went in and talked to a deputy named Marsh who was about 55 and had the careful, unhurried manner of someone who'd been doing rural law enforcement for a long time. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When we were done, he asked a few questions. Could we describe the man? Did the boat have a registration number visible? Did we get a plate on the white sedan? We hadn't. He wrote everything down and said the property south of the disperse site had had some calls over the years. Nothing he could share details on, but he said it the way you say something when you want the person to hear more than the words. He said he'd do a drive-by on Bull Lake Road that afternoon. Outside the substation, Deb stood by the van and said, "Nothing he could share details on." I said, "Yeah." She said, "Sylvia, that man was in our camp. He walked in while we were right there, packing up, and just stood there." I said, "I know." She put her sunglasses on and looked down the street. Troy was small and quiet, a lumber town going slowly to seed, old storefronts and pickup trucks, and a bar that opened at 10 a.m. Everything normal and visible and populated. After the lake, it felt almost aggressively ordinary, which I think we both needed. We got food at the one diner, and sat in a window booth and ate eggs, and I watched Deb's hands slowly stop shaking over the course of about 30 minutes. She ate everything on her plate, which I took as a good sign. She's the kind of person who loses appetite when she's genuinely afraid, and she'd gotten to the other side of it. Mostly, she asked me if I thought we'd been targeted specifically or just happened to be there. I said I didn't know. She said, because if he watched us come in and then took the boat out that night to look at our camp, and then was at the dock with binoculars when I walked past, and then walked into our site while we were packing. She trailed off. I said, that's a full day of attention. She said, yeah. I kept thinking about the anchor rope coiled in the bow of the boat. It hadn't been deployed. The figure had been out there maintaining position manually for hours in the dark, making no sound. That took effort. That took patience. The kind of patience that doesn't come from idle curiosity. I've been on enough remote job sites and in enough isolated places to know the difference between someone who was weird and someone who was intentional. And everything about the last 18 hours had felt deeply intentional. The geometry of it, the timing, the patience. What I couldn't work out was what it had been building toward. Nothing had happened. He'd watched, he'd stood in our clearing, and we'd left, and that was it. Which left me with two theories. Either we'd left before whatever was going to happen happened, which I didn't love thinking about, or the watching was the point. Some people are satisfied by proximity, by being close to something without being seen, and then revealing themselves at the last moment just long enough to confirm they'd been there. Not to act, just to let you know. I didn't share that theory with Deb. She'd finished her eggs and was drinking coffee and looking more like herself, and I didn't want to put a new thing in her head to carry. Instead, I asked her if she still wanted to do the rest of the trip, and she was quiet for a moment and then said yes. Different spot, somewhere with other people nearby. I said absolutely, and we looked at the map on my phone and picked a Forest Service campground near Libby with full hookups and a camp host and other rigs in the loop, and it felt like the most sensible decision either of us had made in 24 hours. We drove northwest out of Troy with the Cabinet Mountains behind us and the Kootenai River running alongside the highway, and the sky wide and blue and completely indifferent to what we'd been through. Deb found a radio station out of Libby playing older country, and we listened to it without commentary. At some point, she reached in her pack and retrieved the emergency whistle and hung it back on my bag in the cargo area, and the small gesture of returning it, of restoring things to their place, felt like the closest thing to closure we were going to get. We stayed 2 nights at the Kootenai campground outside Libby, and both nights were completely uneventful in the best possible way. Camp hosts doing their evening rounds, a retired couple in a class next to us who offered us homemade cookies, a group of kayakers 3 sites down who laughed too loudly after dark in a way that felt like medicine. I slept well. Deb hiked the Fisher River Trail and came back with mud on her boots and color in her face, and that particular satisfaction she got from hard climbs. Everything was fine, but I thought about Bull Lake every day. Not constantly, not in a way that interrupted things, just the way you think about a door you're not sure you fully closed, a background awareness that comes and goes. I'd lie in the van at night and see that figure in the boat, upright, still, facing shore, and then I'd see the clearing empty and the willow break and the man standing in the middle of it with his hands in his pockets. Patient, already done with whatever he'd come to do. Deb flew home from Kalispell on a Sunday. I drove her to the airport in the morning, and she hugged me for a long time at the departure's curb, longer than usual, and then held me by the arms and looked at me and said, "You have my number." I said I did. She said, "Use it if you go back anywhere near that lake." And I said I wouldn't go back near that lake, and she gave me a look that said she wasn't sure she believed me, which was fair because I wasn't entirely sure I believed myself. I drove south after the airport, no specific destination, just moving. The van felt emptier than usual with just me in it, but I've learned not to mistake that feeling for something it isn't. It's just the recalibration of being alone again after company, and it passes. I drove the highway south of Kalispell along the Flathead River and found a pull-off above a bend in the river late in the afternoon and parked and made dinner and sat with the door open watching the water move. The Flathead was fast and brown with late summer sediment, totally unlike Bull Lake, and I stared at it for a long time, just appreciating that it moved. I went back to the Bull Lake Road 5 weeks later. I'm not entirely sure why. It felt unfinished, and I've never been good at leaving things unfinished, which is probably a flaw. I drove past the spur in the middle of the day, didn't pull in, just slowed and looked. The tire tracks were still visible in the grass. The tree line was the same. I kept going south until I could see the property, the dock, the house set back in the trees, the dirt driveway. The white sedan was still there. Someone was sitting on the dock in a chair. I drove past without slowing, kept my eyes on the road. In the rearview mirror, the dock shrank and disappeared around the bend, and I drove all the way to the boat ramp at the south end and pulled in and sat in the parking lot for a while. A family was launching a pontoon boat. Kids arguing about life jackets. Normal, full, loud life going on 20 feet from where I was sitting quietly in my van with my hands in my lap. The lake looked different in daylight than it had at night. Bluer, more ordinary. There were other boats on it, moving with motors and wakes and people visible. I sat there and watched them and thought about Deputy Marsh and the nothing he could share details on. I thought about what kind of history accumulates in a place before someone decides to write it down. In rural Montana, in a county with more land than people, the answer is probably a lot. More than finds its way to a report. More than gets spoken in a diner booth or shared between two women eating eggs and trying to slow their hands down. I didn't go back to the spur. I drove north and found a campsite 12 miles up the road in a busy recreation area with a host station and a sign-in sheet, and I wrote my name and license plate in the logbook and felt absurdly better for having done it. Deb called that evening. I told her I'd driven past, and she was quiet for a second and then said, "And?" I said everything looked the same. She said, "Did he see you?" I said I didn't know. "Probably." She said, "Sylvia," and I said I know, and I didn't know. I just hadn't been able to stop myself from needing to look. The lake at night in my memory is always still. That's the thing about water that doesn't move. It holds everything it reflects perfectly, without distortion, without change. The boat, the figure, the dark. I've been on maybe 40 dispersed sites since that July, and I've parked next to rivers and reservoirs and irrigation ponds and high alpine lakes. And every time the water is calm and the night is quiet, I find myself looking. Not expecting anything, not afraid exactly. Just looking. Because I know now, in a way I didn't before, that stillness isn't the same as empty, and quiet isn't the same as safe, and sometimes the thing you can't explain is the thing that stays with you the longest. Not because it was the worst thing, but because it never finished. My name is Boyd Callahan. I'm 38 years old, and I live out a 1995 Econoline 150 that I've been driving since I bought it off a church in Spokane for $2,200 3 years ago. The church had used it to shuttle elderly parishioners to Sunday service, which meant it had low miles, decent tires, and an interior that smelled permanently of floral perfume and hard candy. I ripped out the bench seating, built a platform bed against the driver's side wall, and left the rest mostly empty. A milk crate for food, a canvas bag for tools, a folding table I almost never unfold. I do seasonal wildfire mitigation work, mostly in the northern Rockies, cutting defensible space around rural properties from May through October. In the off-season, I drift. I don't have a plan for this that extends more than a few weeks in any direction, which suits me fine. The woman with me for this trip was Nadia Ferris, 44, who I'd known for 6 years through the fire mitigation circuit. She did the same work on a different crew, and we crossed paths every season at the same properties, the same ranger stations, the same fuel stops on the same highways. She drove a converted Toyota Hiace she'd imported from Japan, white and boxy and surprisingly roomy inside, with a propane setup and a narrow counter and plants in small magnetic pots stuck to the refrigerator door. The plants were real. She watered them with a spray bottle every morning. I found this detail impressive in a way I couldn't fully articulate. We were between jobs. My next contract started the second week of September outside of Eureka, hers the week after in the Bitterroot, and we had 10 days and no particular agenda. Nadia had been reading about the Prairie Mountains in south-central Montana, a small, isolated range on the Wyoming border that most people didn't know existed. The Prairies were a Bureau of Land Management wilderness area, home to a herd of wild horses that had been living there since before anyone could reliably document the beginning of it, and to a set of geological formations, canyon systems, karst caves, limestone ridges that were genuinely unusual for Montana. She wanted to see the horses. I wanted to be somewhere I hadn't been before. We agreed on the Prairies. The access road into the Prairie Mountain Wild Horse Range came off Highway 310 south of Bridger, a small town on the edge of the Bighorn Basin where the country started feeling more Wyoming than Montana, drier, more exposed, the vegetation sparser and lower. The road into the range was a maintained dirt road for the first 8 miles, and then progressively less maintained after that, climbing through juniper and sage onto a high plateau where the air smelled like dry grass and something faintly alkaline. We drove in on a Wednesday afternoon, Nadia's high ace leading because she had better clearance on the rougher sections, my Econoline following at a distance that kept me out of her dust. We found our camp on the plateau edge, a wide flat pull-off with a fire ring and a front row view west over the Bighorn Canyon. 1,000 feet of rimrock dropping away to the river below, the canyon walls going orange and red in the late afternoon light. The scale of it almost wrong, too large for the eye to assemble in one piece. Nadia stood at the rim for a long time without her camera, which told me she was processing rather than documenting. I set up the kitchen area behind the Econoline and started water for coffee and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. We saw the horses before dinner. A small band, a stallion, 3 mares, 2 young ones, came up over the plateau rim about 300 yards south of camp and moved across the open grass in that particular way wild horses have, which is not like domestic horses at all. There's a quality of attention in them, a constant reading of the environment, that domestic horses lose after generations of handled living. These ones moved with their heads up and their ears working, and when the stallion noticed us, he stopped and looked for a long moment, not afraid, just assessing, and then continued across the plateau and disappeared over the far rim. Nadia had the camera out by then and got something. She reviewed the shots without showing me and made a small satisfied sound. Dinner was pasta and a jar of sauce I'd been carrying since Billings and a loaf of bread from the Bridger grocery, and we ate watching the last light leave the canyon walls. The canyon went from orange to rust to a deep purple gray, and the sky above it went from blue to a deep, saturated dark that had more color in it than black. No light pollution out here. The nearest town was 15 miles, and the nearest city was Billings, which was 70. The stars, when they came, were the kind that make the concept of light pollution feel like a genuine crime. Nadia washed the dishes while I got the fire going, and we settled into the camp chairs, and she told me about a conversation she'd had with her daughter in Portland. Her daughter was 16 and going through something ordinary and difficult, the specific difficulty of being 16, and I listened and said the occasional thing that seemed useful and mostly just let her talk it through. She was a good mother the way she was good at most things, attentive without being anxious, present without being consuming. The fire burned low, and the canyon was completely dark below us, and the plateau was enormous around us, and we were 2 small warm things in the middle of all that space, which felt for the moment entirely right. I woke at 6 and made coffee and sat in the Econoline's open side door facing east, watching the light come up over the Prairie ridgeline. The plateau in the early morning was extraordinary. The grass silver with dew, the juniper dark and still, the air cold and absolutely clear. I could see maybe 30 miles east before the curvature of the earth, or the haze of distance made it indefinite. No vehicles on the access road. No sound except wind and a meadowlark somewhere in the sage below the rim. Nadia emerged from the high ace at 6:30 and sprayed her plants and accepted the coffee I handed her, and we stood and looked at the plateau for a while without needing to say anything about it. This was one of the things about traveling with someone you'd known long enough. The morning didn't need to be performed. It could just be what it was. We spent the morning exploring the plateau on foot, following a rough trail that ran south along the canyon rim. The horses were visible twice more, different bands, 5 or 6 animals each time, moving through the sage at that steady, purposeful walk. Nadia photographed, and I walked and looked at the geology, the way the limestone plateau broke into karst features along the eastern edge, sinkholes and solution caves, and small cliff bands where the rock had been eaten out from below by ancient water. The whole range had this quality of being older than the surrounding country, like something that had been set aside from a different time and not fully integrated into the present. We got back to camp around noon. Nadia made lunch, and I walked out to the canyon rim and sat on a rock and ate an apple and looked down into the Bighorn Canyon. The river was a dark green line far below, moving through the shadow of the canyon walls. A pair of ravens were working the thermals at my eye level, which meant I was looking down on ravens, which was unusual and somehow satisfying. I sat there for a while, just watching them. That's when I noticed the camp below. It was on a shelf of rock, maybe 200 feet below the rim, accessible from the canyon side via a route I couldn't see from where I was sitting. Small, a single tent, dark green, and what looked like a camp stove set up on the rock beside it. No vehicle visible anywhere near it. I looked at it for a long time. The shelf was maybe 15 feet wide and 30 feet long, a natural ledge in the canyon wall, completely invisible from the plateau above unless you were sitting exactly where I was sitting at the right angle. You'd have to know it was there to aim for it, or you'd have to come up from the river. I went back and told Nadia, and she came and looked. She said it was probably a river kayaker. People ran the Bighorn below the canyon and sometimes camped on accessible ledges. I said the tent was set up like a semi-permanent camp, not a one-nighter. She looked longer and said she couldn't tell. We agreed it wasn't our business and went back to our own camp and spent the afternoon reading and napping in turns, the plateau quiet and warm under a high sky. The horses came through camp at dusk. That was unexpected. A band of 4, including a pale gray stallion, came up over the canyon rim about 50 feet from where we were sitting and stopped and looked at us and the vehicles with that same quality of thorough assessment. Nadia held completely still, camera raised, but not shooting, just watching. The gray stallion walked toward us about 10 steps and stopped again. I could see his nostrils working. He was reading us. After maybe 90 seconds, he turned and led the band north across the plateau, and they went over the far rim and the sound of their hooves on dry ground faded, and then there was just the wind again. Nadia lowered the camera and said, quietly, "That was something." I said, "Yeah." She said she'd gotten maybe 30 frames and didn't care if none of them were good because she'd seen it. I understood that. There was a category of experience that photographs were documentation of rather than replacement for, and this was firmly in it. We ate dinner and built the fire up and sat late, until nearly midnight because the sky was too good to go inside. The Milky Way was fully visible, the whole band of it, and Nadia knew the constellations in a way I didn't and pointed them out, and I looked where she pointed and mostly saw a sky full of light. At some point she looked toward the canyon and said, "Do you think they can see our fire from that ledge?" I thought about it and said probably. The canyon walls faced the plateau and the fire was between us and the rim. She looked at it for a second and said, "I wonder if they watched the horses." I said maybe they had. She said, "I wonder what else they can see from there." The next morning the tent on the ledge was gone. I went back to the rim spot after coffee and looked down and the shelf was empty. No tent, no stove, nothing. Just bare rock. I stood there and looked at it for a while. The river was in full shadow this early, the canyon walls blocking the sun until well into the morning, and the shelf was just visible in the ambient light. Empty, clean, like no one had been there. I tried to work out the access again. From the plateau rim above, the drop was sheer for the first 40 feet, no route down from where I was standing. For the canyon floor, you'd need to be in a boat or on foot along the riverbank, and the bank wasn't continuous in this section. The walls came down directly to the water in places. It was a hard camp to get to and a hard camp to leave, and whoever had been in it had arrived and departed without us seeing or hearing anything. I mentioned it to Nadia, and she was quiet for a moment, and then said, "They were there all day yesterday, while we were hiking." I said yes. She said they could see us the whole time. I said yes. She absorbed that. She said, "And now they've moved on." I said it looked that way. She poured more coffee and looked at the canyon and said, "I don't love that they were that close without us knowing." I said I didn't either. We planned a second plateau hike for today, north this time toward the limestone escarpment where Nadia had read about a pictograph site. We went anyway. The hike was about 4 miles round trip, and the country was remarkable the whole way. Wild horse tracks in the soft soil, the occasional shed bone of a horse that had died in the range and been left where it fell, the limestone formations getting more dramatic as we went north, the plateau narrowing and the canyon systems on both sides getting closer. The pictograph site was on a protected south-facing limestone overhang, a collection of figures in ochre and a dark pigment, horses and geometric forms and human figures. Old enough that the attribution was contested, but the presence was undeniable. Nadia photographed it carefully from multiple distances without touching anything. On the way back, she was thinking about something and eventually said it. She said she'd been noticing that the horse trail we were following had a second set of tracks layered over it. Human boot prints, recent, pointing south in the direction of our camp. I looked at the ground where she was pointing. She was right. The tracks were clear in the same soft soil that held the horse prints, and they were fresh, the edges still defined. No wind erosion. Someone had come up this trail from the south, toward the pictographs, and then turned around and gone back. Today, probably this morning while we were sitting in camp. We were 4 miles from our camp in open country, and someone had been on this trail between us and it this morning. I kept that arithmetic to myself for about 30 seconds, and then Nadia said, "How far ahead of us are they?" And I said I didn't know, and we both picked up our pace without a word being exchanged about it. Camp was fine when we got back. Nothing disturbed, nothing out of place. Both vehicles exactly as we'd left them, gear where we'd stowed it, the fire ring cold and clean. I walked the perimeter anyway and found nothing. Nadia checked the high ace inside and out and said the same. We stood in the middle of the camp in the afternoon sun and looked at each other, and she said, "I think we're overthinking this." I said, "Probably." She said, "A hiker. The canyon camp was a through hiker," and they moved on. "The boot prints are just someone doing the plateau trail." I said that all made sense. Neither of us said the thing that didn't fit, which was that the plateau trail was not a designated trail and wasn't in any guidebook, and we'd found it by following horse tracks, and a through hiker wouldn't have looked for it. We made dinner and ate, and the evening was beautiful, and the horses came through once more, a different band, and Nadia shot them, and by 9 p.m. the fire was going, and everything felt ordinary, and I was convincing myself it was ordinary when I saw the light in the canyon. Same type as the boat light, diffuse, white, moving along the canyon wall about 100 feet below the rim. Moving north to south, slowly, following the cliff line. Not a headlamp beam. Those cast a sharp cone. This was something softer, more spread out. A lantern, maybe, moving steadily, pausing at intervals, then moving on. I watched it from the canyon rim for a full 5 minutes. It moved the length of the canyon wall we could see from camp, paused at the south end for a... I didn't say anything to Nadia immediately. She was at the fire with her back to the canyon and hadn't seen it. And I stood at the rim and looked at where the light had been and thought about what I wanted to do with the information. Telling her meant the rest of the night went a specific direction. Not telling her felt like a decision I'd have to own later. I told her. She came and stood at the rim, and I described where the light had been and what it had done. She stood there looking at the dark canyon for a while. She said, moving along the wall, like they were looking for something. I said, or following a route they knew. She said, from below. I said I didn't know. The light had been below the rim, but not at canyon floor level, somewhere in between, which suggested a ledge or a route cut into the wall. The kind of thing you'd only know about if you'd been in this canyon before, more than once. We went back to the fire and sat, and the canyon was dark and quiet behind us, and we talked about it in that practical, possibilities narrowing way. The light had not come toward us. It had moved laterally along the wall and then stopped. It hadn't been aimed upward at the plateau. There was no reason yet to think it had anything to do with us. The canyon had its own geography, and whoever was moving through it might have been entirely unaware of the camp 60 feet above them. That was possible. That remained possible. Around 11, Nadia said she was going to sleep and asked what I was going to do. I said I'd stay up a while. She accepted that without pushing and went to the high ace, and I heard the door close and the brief sound of her interior lights, and then the camp was quiet. I sat by the fire with a cup of tea that went cold and watched the canyon and the plateau in alternating sweeps. Nothing came up over the rim. Nothing moved on the plateau. The horses were somewhere in the dark, but I couldn't hear them. At 12:30, I heard the access road. Tires on gravel, slow, no headlights visible from where I sat. The road came in from a north and curved behind a juniper stand about 400 yards from camp before it approached our pull-off, and I couldn't see a vehicle yet, just the sound of it, the specific crunch of tires over loose rock going at walking pace. I stood up. The sound stopped. I sat back down and waited. 5 minutes passed. 10. No further sound. No headlights. Whatever had come up that road had stopped 400 yards short of camp and cut the engine and the lights and was sitting there. I thought about Nadia asleep in the high ace. I thought about the boot prints on the trail and the empty ledge and the light moving along the canyon wall. All of it could be separate. All of it could be the same person. The darkness between those two possibilities was what I sat with. I woke Nadia at 1 a.m. I knocked on the high ace door and she opened it in 10 seconds. Fully awake, which is a military thing that never stopped being impressive. I told her about the vehicle. She got dressed and came out, and we stood in the dark camp and looked north toward where the sound had been. The juniper stand was a black mass against the dark sky. Nothing visible. She said, "How close is the road to the canyon rim up there?" I said, "I didn't know, maybe 50 feet. She thought about that. She said, "Someone parks where they can see the plateau, but we can't see them." I said that was one way to interpret it. She went to the Tacoma. It was the Tacoma, I keep saying high ace, and reached behind the driver's seat and took out a compact flashlight, a heavy one, the kind that was also a significant object if held in a fist. She handed it to me without commentary. She went back inside and came out with a second one, smaller, which she put in her jacket pocket. She said, "We're not leaving tonight. The road in the dark, one track, someone possibly on it, that's worse." I said I agreed. She said, we stay alert, and we leave at first light." I said okay. She said, "I'll take the first watch from inside the Tacoma. You sleep 2 hours, and I'll wake you." I started to say I was fine, and she said my name once, evenly, and I went and laid down in the Econoline. She woke me at 3:30. Nothing had happened. The road was quiet. The canyon was quiet. At 4:15, the vehicle on the road started its engine, and we both heard it, and I sat up fully and listened to it turn around. The sound of the engine reversing, then forward, then the gravel crunch heading back north toward the highway. Leaving. I went to the Tacoma and knocked, and Nadia cracked the window, and I said, "It's going." She said, "I know." We listened until the sound faded completely, and then it was just wind and the dark plateau and first light beginning to gray in the east. We left as soon as there was enough light to drive the road safely. Nadia led, and I followed, and we drove the 8 miles of dirt to the highway in 20 minutes without stopping. At the highway junction, we both pulled over and got out and stood between the two vehicles in the morning air and looked back toward the Prairies. The plateau was invisible from here, just the dark ridge of the range rising above the basin, the sky above it going from gray to pale blue. A meadowlark was going somewhere in the sage. A semi came down 310 from the north and passed us and went south, and the sound of it faded and the meadowlark continued. Nadia said, "I'm going to call the Prairie Mountain Wild Horse Range Field Office when it opens." I said that was a good idea. She said, "Tell them there's someone camping on the canyon wall, the ledge camp, and the vehicle that parked on the access road at night." I said it wasn't illegal to park on a public road. She said, "No, but the ledge camp might be in a restricted zone, and either way, someone should know." I said, "Yeah." She put her hands in her jacket pockets and looked at the range. She said, "Do you think it was the same person?" "All of it." I said I'd been trying to answer that for 2 days. She said, "The canyon camp, the boot prints on the trail, the light on the wall, the vehicle. One person or a few?" I said I genuinely didn't know, and that not knowing was the specific thing that had kept me awake. We drove north to Bridger and stopped at the same gas station we'd used coming in and got coffee and sat at the 2 plastic tables out front in the early sun. The Bighorn Basin spread out south of us, wide and dry and clear in the morning light. A woman walked past with a dog. A man in a farm truck pulled in and nodded at us and filled up and left. Ordinary Tuesday morning in a small Montana town. I drank the coffee and felt the specific recalibration of being in a populated place after nights in the remote dark. Nadia called the field office at 8 a.m. when they opened. She was on the phone for 12 minutes. I watched her from the table. She was standing by the high ace, one hand in her pocket, talking in that direct, specific way she talked when she was conveying information rather than having conversation. When she came back, she sat down and said the field office knew about the canyon ledge. Knew about it specifically. There had been reports of someone camping on a series of ledges in the Bighorn Canyon section over the past several weeks. A person or persons who accessed the ledges from the river and moved between them. They were working with the BLM River Rangers. She said the woman on the phone had sounded like she was choosing her words carefully, which was its own kind of information. I looked at my coffee. Several weeks, I said. She said yes, which meant they'd been there when we arrived, which meant the plateau camp, the trail, the boot prints, all of it had been within range of someone who'd been embedded in that canyon system for weeks, watching the plateau from below, moving in the dark. Nadia said, the field office woman said we were right to leave when we did. I said she said that specifically? Nadia said not in those words. She said the situation was ongoing and that she'd advise visitors to use the developed campground at the North Trailhead until it was resolved. I sat with that. We parted ways at the Laurel Junction. She was heading west toward Missoula. I was heading north toward Havertys Stage for the September job. We stood between our vehicles at the interchange and she hugged me for a long time and I hugged her back and neither of us said anything dramatic about it, which felt right. She got in the Tacoma and I watched her signal and merge onto the westbound and go, the white Toyota shrinking and disappearing into the Yellowstone River Valley. And then I got in the Econoline and sat for a moment. I still think about the gray stallion walking toward us on the plateau, reading us with his nostrils from 10 feet away. That patience, that absolute confidence in his own ability to assess what was in front of him. I've tried to apply it since, to slow down and read the thing in front of me before deciding what it is. Most of the time, I'm reading campgrounds and job sites and highway on-ramps, and nothing requires more than a glance. But sometimes I park somewhere remote, and in the night, there's a quality to the dark that tells me I'm not the only one in it. And I think about that stallion, and I get very still, and I let my senses do what senses are built to do. And sometimes it's nothing. And sometimes it's the particular quiet of something that knows you're there and is deciding. I've learned to leave before it decides. My name is Reese Tabor. I'm 41 years old, and I live in a 2003 Dodge Ram 3500 with a slide-in camper that I bought off a retired wheat farmer outside of Billings for $4,000 cash. The camper is ugly, faded beige exterior, a water stain on the ceiling above the dinette that looks like the state of Florida, a fold-down bunk over the cab that I use for storage because my knees don't bend right anymore after a bad fall on a job site in 2019. I sleep on the converted dinette, which is narrow and slightly tilted toward the left, and I've gotten used to it the way you get used to most things that inconvenience you daily, by stopping noticing. I do freelance electrical work, mostly agricultural, mostly following the harvest season from south to north and back again. I know how grain elevators work, how irrigation pivots are wired, how to replace a 3-phase motor in a bin dryer at 2 a.m. while a farmer stands behind me in the dark holding a flashlight and not talking. I like the work. I like that it ends. The other person in this story is my younger brother, Callum Tabor, 36, who drove up from Denver with 3 days off and a vague idea about seeing eastern Montana before he turned 40, which he had 4 years to accomplish, but had apparently decided was now urgent. Callum is an architect, which means he looks at every building and landscape as a composition problem and narrates his observations whether you've asked for them or not. He is genuinely good company once you've accepted this. He brought good whiskey, which helped. He'd never been in a camper before and spent the first 20 minutes opening every cabinet and drawer with the focused curiosity of someone inspecting a very small building, which I suppose it was. We were headed to the Malta area in Phillips County. The Highline country, flat and enormous and largely forgotten by anyone who doesn't live there. I'd done a job near Malta 2 summers ago, rewiring an old grain co-op out on the highway, and I remembered the country around it. The way the prairie just went in every direction without apology, the coulees cutting through the benchland, the Milk River Valley sitting low and green below all that open sky. Callum had read something about the area's homestead history and had a list of abandoned structures he wanted to photograph. I had no job lined up until the following Monday in Havre. We had 4 days and nothing specific to do with them, which is my preferred condition. Phillips County is one of the least populated counties in the lower 48. Malta has maybe 2,000 people, a dinosaur museum that punches way above its weight, and a main street that looks like it's been mid-renovation since 1987. East of town, the highway runs straight and flat, and the grain elevators rise out of the prairie every 15 miles or so, silver and white, visible from 10 miles out. I'd always found them oddly comforting. Those big functional structures standing alone in all that space, built for a single purpose and doing it without complaint for 100 years. Callum found them architecturally fascinating, which meant he photographed 4 of them before we even reached our campsite. The location I'd picked was about 18 miles east of Malta, down a county road that turned to gravel after 3 miles, near a stretch of the Milk River where the cottonwoods grew thick and the banks were soft and undercut. I noted it on my last trip through, a wide flat pull-off above the riverbank, screened from the road by a low ridge, with a fire pit ring someone had dug years ago, and a view up the river valley that went on until the light haze of distance swallowed it. No signs, no designation, no fee. Just a place where someone had clearly camped before, and the ground was packed flat from it. We got there in the late afternoon, the sun still high and hot the way it gets in eastern Montana in August, a dry, direct heat that has nothing apologetic about it. Callum got out and walked immediately to the riverbank and stood looking down at the Milk River, which is not a big river, but has a particular color, brownish green, silty, slow-moving, that makes it look older than it is. He said, "It looks like it's been here longer than the land," and I said that was probably true in some geological sense, and handed him a beer. We set up the camp chairs in the shade of the camper and drank the first 2 beers of the trip and listened to the cottonwood leaves moving in the river wind, which is a very specific sound, dry and papery, almost like static. I had the camp stove going by 7 and made the chili I always made on the first night of any trip, which Callum called aggressively utilitarian and ate 2 bowls of. We found a decent radio signal out of Malta, classic country, appropriate, and I'd set up the small screen on the tailgate so we could watch the light change over the river. The benchland across the valley went from brown to orange to a deep rust color as the sun dropped, and the grain elevators I could see about 6 miles east caught the last light and held it like they were keeping it. Normal evening. Good evening. The kind of evening that earns its place in the memory. Callum asked about the abandoned homestead he'd read about, a property about 2 miles east of where we were camped, down a 2-track that ran along the river. Old German-Russian settlement, late 1800s, stone foundation house, still standing, plus a collapsed barn and a granary that was somehow still mostly upright. He wanted to go in the morning, early light before it got hot. I said, "Sure, I'll drive us in." He said he'd been reading that some of the homestead properties in this county had been in the same family for generations, and a few were still technically private land, even though the structures had been abandoned for decades. I said we'd check before we went in. The night came in fast the way it does on the Highline, the temperature dropping 20 degrees in 40 minutes once the sun was gone. We moved from the camp chairs to inside the camper, the window screens letting in the cottonwood-scented river air. Callum poured the whiskey. We talked about our father for a while, which we did sometimes when we were somewhere remote and there was no distraction from it. He'd been gone 4 years, and the conversations were easier now, less about grief and more about memory, which felt like progress. By 10, we were both tired in the clean, physical way that comes from good air and good food, and Callum climbed into the cab bunk despite his knees being fine and was asleep in minutes. I straightened the dinette and laid down and listened to the river and the cottonwoods and fell asleep thinking about nothing in particular, which is the best possible way to fall asleep. I woke up at 4:50 because of the smell. Not a bad smell, exactly, or not immediately. It was the smell of dust and something beneath it, something dry and mineral, like the inside of an old building that's been sealed for years. Like grain dust and machine oil and old wood baking in summer heat. I know that smell from decades of agricultural work. It's the smell of a grain elevator or a dry storage building, and it had no business being inside my camper at 4:50 in the morning next to a river. I lay still and tried to locate it. The window vents were open 2 inches on the driver's side, 1 on the passenger, and I thought maybe the wind had shifted and was coming from the east where the elevator was. 6 miles was too far for smell to carry, but the air in the Milk River Valley did strange things in the cool pre-dawn hours, channeling and concentrating along the river corridor. I told myself that and almost believed it. I turned over and pulled the wool blanket up and lay there smelling old grain and trying to go back to sleep. At 5:15, I heard a vehicle. Distant at first, just the low register of a diesel engine, the kind that carries a long way in flat country. I tracked it with my eyes closed, listening to it get closer, thinking it was someone on the county road passing through. But it didn't pass. The engine slowed and then stopped, and by the sound of it, it had stopped somewhere close. On the 2-track that ran east along the river, maybe or on the road above our ridge. I couldn't pin it down. I lay there and listened for a door, for voices, for any of the sounds that would have told me it was innocent. Hunters out early, a rancher checking cattle, someone who lived out here and had every right to be on these roads before sunrise. Nothing. The engine was off, and there was no sound that followed it. I got up quietly and went to the small window over the dinette and looked out. The sky was a deep blue-gray, just enough pre-dawn light to see the pull-off and the ridge above us and the road beyond it. Nothing visible. I went to the cab and looked through the windshield and then through each side window, and I didn't see a vehicle or a person anywhere. The smell was still there, faint now, or maybe I'd gotten used to it. I stood in the cab in my socks and a t-shirt and listened to the night, and it gave me nothing back. Callum was still asleep in the bunk above me. I could hear him breathing, slow and even. I thought about waking him and decided against it. There was nothing to report. A smell and a sound and an absence of explanation. I went back and lay down, and this time I didn't sleep, but I rested, and by 6:30 the sky was light enough to make out colors, and I got up and started the coffee and stood in the camper doorway watching the river. The Milk River moved its slow brown self downstream without comment. Cottonwoods, birds, a high bright sky coming in from the east. Callum dropped down from the bunk at 7 and immediately wanted to talk about the homestead. He'd done more reading the night before on a downloaded article and had a clearer picture of the property. The Brower homestead, originally filed in 1898 by a family named Brower out of the German-Russian communities that had settled the Highline. Stone house, 2-story, unusual for the area because most homestead structures were wood frame. The granary was original to the property. He wanted to be there by 8:30 for the light. I drove us in on the 2-track, the Dodge handling the rough ground without complaint. The river was on our left, close enough to hear the cottonwood corridor thick and green along the bank. The benchland rose to our right, pale yellow-brown grass and sage, and the occasional eroded coulee dropping away into shadow. 2 miles in, the 2-track opened slightly, and the homestead appeared through a gap in the trees. And I'll give Callum this, he knew what he was talking about. The stone house was remarkable. Limestone block, hand-cut, the walls still plumb after 125 years. The windows gone, but the frames intact. The roof partially collapsed on the east end, but holding on the west. The granary stood about 30 feet north, wood frame, vertical board and batten siding, silver gray with age, somehow still standing with its door hanging open on one hinge. Callum was out of the truck before I'd fully stopped and moving toward the house with his camera. I stayed back and looked at the property for a minute. The 2-track continued past the homestead for another 100 yards or so and then ended at what looked like an old equipment yard. Rusted implements half buried in grass, the skeleton of something large that might have been a thresher. And parked at the edge of the equipment yard, barely visible through the grass and the tree line, was a white truck. Old, full size, no movement around it. I sat in the Dodge and looked at that truck for a while. It was pointing away from us, nose toward the river trees. It had been there long enough that the grass had grown up around the front tires. But the windshield was clear, no dust accumulation, no bird droppings on the glass. It had been moved recently. Maybe not today, maybe not yesterday, but recently enough that it was clean. I got out and walked over to Callum and told him, quietly, that we weren't alone on the property. He looked over at the equipment yard and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is it a problem?" And I said I didn't know yet. Callum kept shooting. I knew he would. That was just who he was, and I didn't try to stop him. But he stayed close to me, and he kept his voice down, and every few minutes he glanced toward the equipment yard the way you glance at something you're trying not to look like you're watching. I walked the perimeter of the homestead while he worked. The stone house smelled like must and pigeon and the particular cold that old masonry holds even in August. Inside, through a window opening, I could see the collapsed east section. Roof beams down, stone from the upper wall scattered across a wooden floor that had given way in the middle. On the floor, near the doorway, a coffee cup. Plastic, modern, the kind from a gas station. Not old. I turned it over with the toe of my boot. Not dusty. A few days old at most. I looked at it for a second and left it where it was and walked back outside. Callum was photographing the granary from the north side, crouching to get the angle. I came and stood next to him and said quietly, "Someone's been in the house recently." He lowered his camera slowly. I said, "Gas station cup, no dust on it." He looked at me and then looked at the white truck in the equipment yard and said, "Staying here?" I said I didn't know. Maybe camping in the truck, maybe just passing through and stopping. He nodded and went back to his camera, and I could tell by the set of his shoulders that he was less relaxed than he'd been 30 seconds ago. The granary door was swinging slightly in the river wind, the single hinge creaking on a slow rhythm. I walked toward it. The smell hit me about 10 feet out. That same smell from the camper this morning. Grain dust, machine oil, old dry wood. Strong here, which made sense, but strong in a way that felt concentrated, like the building was actively exhaling it. I pushed the door open wider with my forearm and looked inside. Old grain bins along the back wall, with slack construction, empty and warped. A central open floor space, the boards dry and gray. An old hand auger leaning against one wall. And on the floor, near the far corner, a sleeping bag. Unrolled, used, the kind of cheap synthetic bag that compresses flat when slept in and holds the shape of whoever was last in it. Next to it, a backpack, military surplus, worn smooth at the straps. A water bottle. A paperback book face down on the floor. Someone had been sleeping in the granary, and based on the look of the sleeping bag, had been sleeping there regularly. I backed out of the granary and pulled the door to its resting position and went to Callum and told him. He stood up fully and looked at the granary and then at the equipment yard. "How recent?" he said. I said the book was face down, like someone had put it down to go do something and planned to come back to it. He looked at the equipment yard again, longer this time. The white truck hadn't moved. "We should go," he said. I said yeah. We walked back to the Dodge at a normal pace. I didn't want to move fast. Fast movement reads as either aggression or fear, and I didn't want to provoke or signal either one. Callum got on the passenger side, and I got behind the wheel and started the truck and turned it around on the 2-track. And the whole time I was watching the equipment yard, the granary, the tree line along the river. Nothing moved. Nobody came out. On the drive back to Camp, Callum was quiet for about half a mile and then said, "The cup in the house and the sleeping bag in the granary. Same person?" I said, "Probably." He said, "So they're sleeping in the granary and spending time in the house." I said, "It looked that way." He said, "And their truck is right there, which means they were on foot this morning, which means they were..." He stopped. I finished it. "Somewhere between here and where we camped." He looked out the window at the river trees. "The smell," he said. Not a question. I've been thinking about that since we'd left the granary. 2 miles between our camp and the homestead. Someone on foot, moving along the river corridor in the dark, pre-dawn. The smell reaching the camper vents sometime around 5 a.m. The vehicle sound that didn't produce a visible vehicle because it had stopped at the homestead, not at our camp. Someone who'd been walking toward us, or past us, or near us, and had come back to the homestead before we'd woken up fully. Or not come back yet. I didn't actually know when the Dodge at the equipment yard had last moved. Back at camp, I put coffee on, and Callum sat in the camp chair and looked at the river and didn't say much for a while. The morning was beautiful. High clouds, light wind, the cottonwoods doing their papery shuffle. He finally said, "I want to know who's living in that granary." And I said I understood, but that wasn't our business to find out. He said, "What if it's someone who needs help?" And I said that was possible, but if someone needed help and there was a working truck 30 feet from where they slept, they weren't without options. He accepted that slowly. What I didn't say was that my primary feeling about the person in the granary wasn't concern. It was the feeling I got on certain job sites when I first walked in and something about the setup wasn't right. Not broken, not dangerous on its face, just off. Like a circuit that was wired incorrectly but hadn't blown yet. I learned to trust that feeling over years of working in buildings where one wrong thing could put you on the ground. I trusted it now, and what it was telling me was that we should be somewhere else before dark. I said I wanted to move camp. I framed it practically. We planned to move east towards Saco anyway. Might as well do it today, find a spot closer to the site Callum wanted to photograph Thursday. He knew I was recasting it, but he didn't push back, which told me he felt the same way and was fine with a justification that let us both act without naming the thing we were acting on. We packed efficiently. I always kept the camper organized enough that a quick pack was 20 minutes, not an hour. Equipment in its cabinet, food in its bin, water jug secured. Callum folded the camp chairs and stowed the cooler and carried the camp stove to the truck bed and was ready in 15 minutes, which for an architect who approached packing the way he approached design problems, methodically, with an opinion about where everything belonged, was unusually fast. I was doing a last check of the pull-off, making sure we'd left it the way we'd found it when I saw the footprints. They were in the soft mud at the top of the riverbank, about 20 feet south of where we'd been camped, in a spot I wouldn't have looked at except that I always walked the perimeter before leaving a site. 2 sets of prints coming up from the river direction, stopping at the top of the bank, turning, facing the camp. The mud was softer here and the impressions were clear. A heavy boot, large, with a lug sole. Both sets of the same boots, so one person, up and back. They stopped about 15 feet from where the camper had been parked overnight. I crouched and looked at them for a long time. The mud at the river's edge held moisture well, and the prints could have been from yesterday or 2 days ago, but the edges were still sharp, not dried and crumbled the way old prints got in this heat. These were from last night or very early morning. Someone had walked up from the river, stood here looking at our camp, and walked back down. From that position, in the dark, they could have seen the camper clearly. Could have been 10 feet from where Callum was sleeping. I stood up and said nothing. I took a photo on my phone and walked back to the truck and got in and started it. Callum was already in the passenger seat with his notebook out, planning the next location. I pulled onto the 2-track and headed west toward the county road. In the rearview mirror, the pull-off disappeared behind the cottonwoods. I drove. We found a new site that afternoon about 22 miles east near the town of Saco, in a wide cottonwood flat along the river with a gravel 2-track approach that was visible from the highway. Not as private as the Malta site, but that was fine with me. Another camp rig was parked about a quarter mile up the flat, a travel trailer. A family by the look of the bikes leaned against it. Human presence felt like a feature. I backed the camper in, cut the engine, and sat for a second looking at the river. Callum asked why I'd really wanted to move. I took my phone out and showed him the photo of the footprints. He stared at the screen for a long time. He enlarged the image, studied the edges of the prints, the direction they faced. He handed the phone back without a word and looked out through the windshield of the river. Then he said, "How close?" I said about 15 feet from the camper door. He nodded slowly. He said, "The smell at 5 a.m. That was them walking back." I said, "Probably." He said, "So they came, looked, and left." I said yes. He was quiet. Then why? That was the question. Why stand 15 feet from a stranger's camper in the dark and look at it and leave? Not to steal. Nothing was missing, and if you were going to take something, you'd get closer and you'd do it, not just look. Not to make contact. They'd had ample opportunity in daylight when we were at the homestead. Not a threat exactly, or not one that had been acted on. Just presence. just proximity and looking the same way the figure in the boat on Bull Lake had just looked. Montana was a big, empty state, and sometimes the people who chose to live in its most remote corners chose it because they wanted something from isolation that the rest of us didn't fully understand. And sometimes that something expressed itself in ways that didn't translate well into the behavioral language of people who lived among other people. That was the rational version. The version I gave Callum sitting in that truck by the Milk River with the family's bikes visible a quarter mile away. It satisfied him enough to get out of the truck and start unpacking, and it was even mostly true. The other version, the one I kept for myself, was that we had been looked at very carefully from very close by someone who had gone to some effort to do it quietly, and that we had left before we'd found out what looking was the precursor. The last 2 days of the trip were good, genuinely good. The kind of good that sometimes follows something unsettling, like your nervous system overcorrecting into gratitude. Callum found the abandoned grain elevator complex he'd wanted about 4 miles north of Saco on a dead-end section road, and spent most of Thursday in it with his camera while I read in the truck with the windows down. The structures were extraordinary. 3 connected elevators, wood cribbing construction, the tallest one still over 100 feet, all of it silver gray and leaning slightly east like they were listening to something in that direction. Nobody around for miles. Completely peaceful. We drove back through Malta on Friday and stopped at the Dinosaur Museum because Callum wanted to, and I'd been before, but didn't mind going again. It's a genuinely remarkable place. Rex skull found 20 miles away. The whole collection assembled by local paleontologists who've been quietly doing serious science in this nowhere county for 40 years. Callum spent 45 minutes on a single display about the Hell Creek Formation, and I bought a coffee and a postcard and let him. On the way out, he said, "This whole place is like that. You look at it and you think empty, and then you look closer and it's been full the whole time." I thought about the homestead and the granary and the footprints in the mud and said, yeah. I dropped Callum at the Havre Airport on Saturday morning. He had a direct to Denver. At the gate, or what passed for a gate in Havre's small terminal, he turned and said, "I've been thinking about the guy at the granary." I said, "Me too." He said, "Do you think he's okay?" And I understood the question, not okay as in safe, but okay as in a person who was doing all right, surviving out there in an abandoned building with a paperback and a sleeping bag and a truck that might or might not still run. I said I didn't know. He said he'd looked up Phillips County Social Services on his phone, and there wasn't much. I said no, there wouldn't be. He said, "It just seems like a hard way to live," and I said a lot of ways were hard and most of them were invisible from the road. He flew and I drove east on Highway 2, the Highline stretching out ahead of me flat and enormous, the grain elevators rising and receding every 15 miles. I had a job Monday morning in Havre, irrigation pivot controls on a farm outside town, routine work. I camped somewhere between here and there, nothing remote, nothing hidden. I'd had enough of hidden for this trip. But somewhere east of Malta, I slowed down and turned off the highway onto the county road that led back toward the river. I don't know what I intended. Maybe just to drive past the pull-off and confirm it was empty. Maybe something else. I drove the 3 miles of gravel to where the pavement ended and then continued another mile to the low ridge above our old camp. I stopped the truck on the ridge and looked down. The pull-off was empty. Just flattened grass where the camper had been, and the fire pit ring cold and dark, and the river moving past the cottonwoods the way it always had and always would. I looked at the site for a while. The mud at the top of the riverbank where the prints had been was too far to see from here, but I knew it was there, drying now, the edges crumbling in the August heat. I looked east along the 2-track toward the Brower homestead, 2 miles away through the Cottonwood corridor. Nothing moving. The prairie on both sides of the river flat and still. I sat in the truck for a while and thought about Callum's question. Do you think he's okay? And the honest answer was that I didn't know, and that the not knowing had a texture to it that I recognized from the work I did in old buildings. The particular uncertainty of something that has been under stress for a long time and might hold or might not, and the only way to find out is to wait. And waiting from a distance feels like abandonment, and staying close feels like intrusion, and neither option gives you the information you're actually after. I put the truck in reverse and backed up to where I could turn around and drove back to the highway. The Highline opened up ahead of me, wide and pale and impossibly long. The kind of country that makes everything feel small and provisional and temporary, which it is, and which I've learned to find more comforting than not. I turned west on Highway 2 and drove, and behind me the Milk River moved on through the cottonwoods, and the granary stood in the August heat with its door on one hinge. And whether anyone was in it or not, the smell of old grain and dry wood and long-held time went on being exactly what it had always been, patient and quiet and complete. My name is Loretta Vass. I'm 53 years old, and I live in a 2008 Sprinter van that I converted over 2 winters in the driveway of my house in Bozeman before I sold the house and made the van the whole thing. I was a physical therapist for 22 years. I was good at it, and it wore me down to something thin and brittle, the way good work sometimes does when you do it long enough without stopping. And one morning I sat in the parking lot of the clinic for 40 minutes without getting out of my car and understood that I was done. I gave notice that week. The van conversion started the month after. I do occasional telehealth consults now, enough to cover fuel and food, and I spend the rest of my time moving through the parts of this country that reward slowness. With me for this particular trip was a woman named Greta Pohl, 59, who I'd met 2 years earlier at a dispersed campsite outside Lander, Wyoming, where we'd ended up parked 20 feet apart by coincidence and had shared a campfire and talked until midnight and exchanged numbers in the morning. Greta was retired from the Army, 24 years, logistics. She'd been everywhere and seen most things and had a calm about her that wasn't detachment. It was more like a well-calibrated instrument that had been tested enough times to trust its own readings. She drove a tan Toyota Tacoma with a rooftop tent and a storage drawer system in the bed so organized it looked like a surgical theater. She was meticulous in a way I found deeply restful. Also with us, and this requires some explanation, was Greta's nephew Finn Pohl, 29, who was going through something. Not a crisis exactly, more like the slow realization, arriving on schedule in the late 20s, that the life you've been building wasn't the life you actually wanted, and the particular paralysis that comes with that realization before you've figured out what to do about it. He'd been staying with Greta in Missoula for 6 weeks, working at a coffee shop, running every morning, talking less than Greta would have liked. She'd invited him on the trip because she thought movement helped. She'd always believed that, and because she didn't want to leave him alone in her apartment for 2 weeks with his own thoughts. He was quiet and watchful and had very good manners, and occasionally said something so unexpectedly precise that it stopped the conversation entirely. Our destination was the Big Snowy Mountains, a small, isolated range in the center of Montana that rises out of the plains south of Lewistown, like something that got separated from the Rockies and decided to make a go of it alone. The range is maybe 20 miles across, topping out around 8,000 feet, ringed by grassland on all sides. There's a Forest Service road that loops through the mountains, Crystal Lake Road, with one developed campground at Crystal Lake and then miles of dispersed camping along the forest road beyond it. Petra had recommended it to me a year ago. Not Petra from the previous trip, a different Petra, and I've been meaning to get there ever since. We met at a gas station in Lewistown on a Tuesday morning, Greta's Tacoma and my Sprinter sitting side by side at the pump, while we transferred a cooler and 2 bags of firewood into my van because hers was already full. Finn helped without being asked, which I noted. Lewistown is a pretty town, old brick downtown, big sky overhead, the kind of place that looks like it knows what it is and isn't trying to be anything else. We got coffee from a drive-through and headed south on Highway 191. The Big Snowy's visible ahead of us after about 10 miles, blue-gray and compact above the tan grassland. The Crystal Lake Road turnoff was marked, the forest road decent for the first 6 miles, then progressively more washed out as we climbed. Greta followed in the Tacoma, and I watched her in the rear view, her truck handling the terrain without any drama. Finn was in my passenger seat, watching the landscape shift from grassland to ponderosa pine to Douglas fir as we gained elevation, and he said almost nothing for the whole drive, which I'd learned was his version of paying attention. The forest road curved around the north shoulder of the range, and the Crystal Lake campground appeared, small, mostly full. The lake itself turquoise green and cold looking below a limestone cliff face. We drove past the campground. The dispersed zone started about a mile beyond it, the road narrowing to a single track through the timber. I'd scouted it on satellite before leaving Lewistown and had to pull off in mind. A wide flat spot on the east side of the road near a small creek drainage, about 3 miles past the campground, that showed good tree cover and a southern exposure. It took us 20 minutes to reach it on the rough road, and when we did, it was exactly what I'd hoped. Flat, sheltered, a small creek audible below the tree line, a window in the canopy facing south that would give us morning light. We made camp in that unhurried way that comes from people who've done it enough to have a rhythm. Greta had the rooftop tent up in 8 minutes. I set up the sprinter's side awning and put the camp chairs out. Finn gathered firewood from the deadfall along the creek without being asked. He'd been to enough of these trips with Greta to know the routine, and stacked it neatly by the stone ring that a previous camper had built. By 4 in the afternoon, we had coffee going, and the afternoon light was coming through the canopy in long yellow bars, and the creek was making its small persistent sound below us, and everything felt, as it sometimes did in these mountains, like the exact right place to be. Greta sat in her camp chair with both hands around her mug and looked up through the firs of the sky and said, 9 miles from the pavement. She said it the way she said most things, as a simple fact, delivered without editorializing, but I understood what she meant. 9 miles from the pavement was the right kind of distance. Far enough to be genuinely alone. Not so far that a problem became a catastrophe. Dinner was Greta's production. She'd marinated chicken in a bag since Lewistown and had a cast iron that nested into a specific corner of her truck bed like it had been built for it. She cooked over the fire with the efficiency of someone who'd fed people in worse conditions than this, and the result was considerably better than what I would have made, which Finn acknowledged by eating a quantity of food that suggested he'd been undereating for weeks. We didn't comment on it. After dinner, the conversation found its level, the way it did on the second drink of the evening. A little slower, a little more honest. Finn asked me why I'd left the clinic, and I told him the parking lot story, the 40 minutes in the car, the sudden clarity. He listened to the whole thing and then said, "So you knew before you knew?" And I said, "Yes, that's exactly what it was." He nodded and looked at the fire, and I had the sense he was applying it to something. Greta caught my eye over his head and made no expression at all, which was her version of acknowledgement. The night came on, and the temperature dropped fast the way it did at elevation. We were close to 7,000 feet, and the August nights up here had a genuine bite. I added wood to the fire, and Finn pulled his jacket hood up, and Greta produced a wool blanket from the Tacoma and draped it over her shoulders with the practiced ease of someone who'd slept in far colder places than this. We sat until about 10, and then the fire was low enough that the cold was winning, and we called it. I went into the Sprinter and changed and got into my sleeping bag and lay in the dark with the roof vent cracked. The creek was audible, a consistent, low sound, steady and unremarkable. Wind in the firs above. I ran through the next day loosely in my mind. I wanted to hike the ridge above camp. Greta had mentioned the North Face Trail. Finn had said nothing specific, but would likely follow whatever we decided. Clean plan. I relaxed into it and was asleep within 20 minutes, which was fast for me in a new place. Something woke me at 1:30. I wasn't sure what. I lay still and listened. The creek, the wind, nothing obviously wrong. But I was awake in that specific way that has a reason behind it, and I've learned not to dismiss that even when I can't immediately name the cause. I lay there for 2 or 3 minutes, just listening, breathing slowly, cataloging sounds. Then I heard it, or rather, I heard the absence of it. The creek had not stopped, but underneath the creek, below its register, there had been something else, a low, irregular sound, not mechanical, not wind, and now it wasn't there. I sat up and looked through the side window. The camp was lit by a half moon coming through the canopy. I could see the fire ring, the camp chairs, Greta's truck, the edge of the road. Nothing moving. I looked toward the tree line on the north side and the creek drainage below it. Dark, dense. The firs down there were old growth, the kind that block light at every level and make the forest floor black, even in daylight. I stared at it for a while, and it gave me nothing back. Then Greta knocked on the side of the van. 2 knocks, quiet, deliberate. I was at the door in seconds. She was standing outside in her jacket and the wool blanket, and her face in the moonlight had that calibrated instrument quality, reading something carefully. She said, very quietly, "Finn heard something on the drainage side. He's been awake since 1." I stepped out and pulled the door mostly closed behind me. The cold was immediate and real. Finn was standing near Greta's truck, not the fire, which put him farther from the road and closer to the drainage. He was facing north toward the creek. I went and stood next to him, and he said, without turning, "It stopped when I moved toward it." He wasn't scared, or not primarily. He had the same quality Greta had, a focused attentiveness that was more interesting than afraid. I said, "What did it sound like?" He thought for a second. He said, "Like something adjusting its weight." Repeatedly, like it kept settling and unsettling. He paused. Large. Greta came and stood on my other side, and the three of us stood in the moonlit camp looking at the drainage, and the drainage looked back at us with perfect indifference. The creek moved. The firs were still. Nothing came out. We went back inside after 20 minutes. Not because we'd resolved anything. We hadn't. But because standing in the cold staring at a tree line at 2 a.m. was not producing information. Greta's assessment was bear, which was the reasonable assessment. Black bears and the big snowies were common. The creek drainage was the kind of habitat they moved through at night, and a bear hearing a human move toward it and going still was textbook behavior. Finn said he'd accept that explanation provisionally. I said same. We all went back to our respective beds. I did not sleep again. I lay in the bag and listened to the creek and thought about the weight-settling sound Finn had described. I knew what it sounded like when a bear moved through timber. I'd had enough backcountry experience for that, and what he described was consistent with it. But consistent with wasn't the same as confirmed, and my brain, which had been trained for 22 years to listen to bodies and locate sources of discomfort, was staying awake for its own reasons. At 4 a.m., I heard footsteps on the road, not on the drainage, on the road itself. The forest road we'd coming on, single track, 100 feet from the van. Footsteps on gravel. The specific crunch and scrape of a boot on loose stone. Slow, not rushed, moving south. Moving away from the Crystal Lake campground and deeper into the dispersed zone, which meant deeper in, not out. I lay completely still and counted the steps until they faded below the sound of the creek. I reached for my phone and opened the Notes app and typed. Footsteps on road for AM, moving south, approximate 15 to 20 steps audible before lost to creek noise. I don't know why I wrote it down. Force of habit from the clinical years. Document what you observe, separate observation from interpretation. I set the phone down and lay there until it was light. Greta was up at first light, as she always was. I came out and we made coffee and I told her what I'd heard. She listened with her mug in both hands and said, "Hiker." I said possible. The trail system connected to the forest road about a half-mile south of us. Someone doing a pre-dawn start on the ridge trail wasn't impossible. She said, or someone who camped further in and walked past. I said yes. She said, or someone who came in on foot from the highway. I said that was 9 miles, and she said people did long trail approaches all the time. All of it was true. What wasn't true was that any of it explained the drainage sound earlier in the night. Greta had said bear, and I'd agreed, and Finn had provisionally agreed. But if the drainage sound and the road footsteps were the same person, someone who'd been on the drainage slope, watching camp, and then moved to the road and kept going, that was a different thing. I didn't say this to Greta. She was already there. I could see it in the way she was holding her coffee and looking at the road. Finn came down from the rooftop tent and ate and was quiet, and then said he wanted to walk the road south, toward where the footsteps had been headed, and look at the trail junction. Greta said she'd go with him. I said I'd stay with the van and make a late breakfast, and they could be back in an hour. What I actually did, once they were out of sight, was walk the road north for about 200 feet and examine the gravel. The road held marks well in the soft shoulders, tire tracks from our vehicles, animal tracks, and there, in a soft patch of decomposed granite near the eastern edge, boot prints heading south. Deep heel, medium width, adult. One set, heading in the direction Finn wanted to walk. I stood in the road and looked south through the firs. The road curved and disappeared. Somewhere down there, a mile or two, was where those steps had been going at 4 a.m. I took a photo and walked back to camp and started breakfast and was cracking eggs into the pan when I heard Greta's whistle. 3 short blasts, the signal we'd agreed on before they left. Not distress. Come here. I turned off the stove and walked south on the road at a pace that was faster than I wanted it to look if anyone was watching. I found them about 3/4 of a mile down at the trail junction. They were standing off the road, looking at something in the grass at the tree line. I came and looked. A camp. Small, minimal. A sleeping bag rolled tight and stuffed under the roots of a large fir. A dry bag wedged into the root cavity beside it. A single burner stove unlit on a flat rock. A water filter hanging from a branch above it. Everything organized and compressed. The sleeping bag was cold to the touch. Whoever had been here had been gone for hours. Or they'd been in it when it was warmer, which was before 4 a.m., which was before the footsteps on the road. We stood around that small camp, and none of us said anything for a while. The setup was deliberate, not a hasty overnight, not a disorganized bushcraft situation. The dry bag under the roots was specifically positioned to be invisible from the road, and from about 10 feet away it was. If Finn hadn't stepped off the road to look at a particular tree he'd wanted to examine, we'd have walked straight past it. That kind of concealment took thought. It was the camp of someone who didn't want to be found. Greta crouched and looked at the sleeping bag without touching it. She said the compression sack was military surplus, the same series she'd used. She recognized the buckle hardware. Not current issue, maybe 10 or 15 years old. She stood up and looked around the immediate area methodically, the way she looked at everything. She said, "They didn't leave. The gear's here." I said, "Right." Finn was looking into the tree line with his arms crossed, not at the camp, but at the forest behind it. I asked him what he was looking at. He said, "There's a line through the undergrowth. Someone's walked that route multiple times." I looked where he was indicating, and he was right. A slight but visible compression of the brush, leading northeast from the hidden camp in the direction of the drainage. We walked back to our camp, and I finished making breakfast, and we ate without a lot of conversation. Greta was processing. I could tell by the way she ate, steadily and without tasting, her attention elsewhere. Finn was doing that precise, interior thing he did when he was working through something. I was thinking about the geometry. The hidden camp, 3/4 of a mile south. The drainage below our camp, where Finn had heard the weight settling sound. The worn line through the undergrowth connecting them. Someone had been moving back and forth between those 2 points, and one of those points was directly adjacent to where we'd been sleeping. After breakfast, Greta said she wanted to break camp and relocate to Crystal Lake, back at the developed campground. She said it simply and without drama, just a reassessment of circumstances leading to a different decision, which was how she made every decision. Finn said okay, immediately. I said I agreed. We broke camp in 40 minutes and were back on the forest road by 10 a.m., the Sprinter leading, Greta's Tacoma behind. We passed the trail junction, and I looked into the tree line as I drove past. The hidden camp was invisible from the road, which I already knew, but I looked anyway. The road curved, and we left it behind. About a mile further north, where the road straightened and I had a long sight line ahead, I saw a figure, walking on a road, moving north ahead of us in the same direction we were going. I eased off the accelerator without stopping. The figure was carrying a pack, a large external frame pack, the kind that sits high above the shoulders. Moving steadily, not looking back. Dark pants, a heavy shirt, a hat. I couldn't tell age or anything specific from this distance. I slowed the van to about 5 miles per hour and followed at 200 feet, watching. Greta's Tacoma slowed behind me. The figure walked for about 30 seconds and then turned off the road to the left, east, and went into the trees and was gone. I stopped the van where they turned off. I sat there and looked at the tree line on the left side of the road. Nothing visible. The trees were dense and the undergrowth was high, and whatever direction they'd gone in, they'd been swallowed immediately. I looked in the rear view at Greta's truck. She had both hands on the wheel and was looking at the tree line. After a moment, she flashed her headlights once, which meant she'd seen it. I put the van in drive and kept going north toward Crystal Lake. The developed campground felt, after the morning we'd had, like arriving somewhere populated and official, and I felt the specific relief of that. A camp host in a golf cart waved at us as we came in. Kids on bikes. Someone's golden retriever investigating the perimeter of a campsite. I pulled into an open spot near the lake and cut the engine and sat for a moment with my hands in my lap. Finn came around to the driver's side window and said, "Was that the same person?" I said I didn't know. He said the pack. It was big enough to carry everything from that camp. I said yes, it was. He looked at the lake. The water was that extraordinary turquoise green, cold and clear, a limestone cliff face rising behind it. He said, "They packed up everything and were already ahead of us on the road, before we even broke camp." I said yes. He looked at me. "So they knew we were leaving?" I said I thought so. He absorbed that and said nothing more and walked to Greta's truck and started helping her unpack. We stayed 2 nights at Crystal Lake. The campground was never more than half full. Quiet in the mornings, a handful of families and a few solo hikers rotating through. Normal campground rhythms. The smell of other people's coffee, a kid crying about something at the site across the loop, the camp host doing his evening rounds on the golf cart at 7 p.m. like clockwork. I slept well both nights, which surprised me a little. On the second afternoon, I hiked the ridge trail alone while Greta and Finn drove back toward Lewistown to resupply. The trail went up through the limestone and broke out above the tree line onto a wide, grassy bench with views in every direction. The big snowies falling away to the north, the plains spreading out below in every shade of tan and brown and green, the Judith Basin enormous and flat to the west. I sat on a rock and ate a sandwich and thought about the person with the pack. I've been turning it over since we'd left the dispersed zone, the camp position for concealment, the worn route between it and our drainage, the footsteps on the road at 4 a.m., the packed up gear already moving, already ahead of us when we left. It added up to someone with real backcountry skill, the kind of skill that comes from years of living and moving in remote country. Not a lost hiker, not a confused weekender, someone who was entirely comfortable in that forest and was choosing deliberately to be invisible in it. The question I couldn't answer was whether proximity to our camp had been incidental or intentional. The worn route through the undergrowth between the hidden camp and the drainage below us that could have predated our arrival. Someone who'd been camped in that spot for days or weeks would naturally develop worn routes to the water source, and the drainage creek was the obvious water. We might have parked directly adjacent to someone's established camp without knowing it, and they might have been watching us simply because we were there the way anyone watches an unexpected addition to their territory. Or not. The alternative was that they'd chosen the drainage slope specifically because it was adjacent to our camp. That they'd been tracking our site since we'd arrived. That the footsteps at 4 a.m. were not retreating to the hidden camp, but moving past it, ahead of us, scouting our exit route. That the figure on the road ahead of us had already packed everything and was moving in our direction of travel, and had stepped off the road and into the trees precisely when we came into view behind them. All of that was also possible, and I didn't know which version was true, and I wasn't going to know. Greta and Finn got back from Lewistown around 5 with groceries and the news that Finn had called his mother from town. This was apparently significant. He hadn't called her in 3 weeks, which had been worrying both Greta and his mother in a quiet, long-distance way. He'd called and they'd talked for 40 minutes, and he seemed, in the way that certain conversations reorganized, something internal lighter. Not fixed, but moving. Greta told me this privately while he was starting the fire, and I said good, and she said yeah. We made a proper dinner, steaks Greta had bought in Lewistown, cooked on a fire grate, with roasted potatoes and a salad that traveled better than it had any right to. We ate at the picnic table, and the camp host came by, and we talked to him for a few minutes about the trail conditions and the weather forecast and the dinosaur museum in Malta, which he said was worth 2 full visits. The night came in softly, and the Crystal Lake surface went dark, and the limestone cliff above it caught the last of the alpenglow. Finn said it looked like something painted, and then said he meant that as a genuine observation, not a cliche, and Greta said she knew, and I said we knew. I drove out of the big snowies the next morning by myself, Greta and Finn heading west toward Missoula. The forest road came back down through the timber, and I drove it slowly, watching the trees. When I passed the trail junction, I didn't stop, but I looked at the tree line where the hidden camp had been. Just trees. Just the ordinary forest going about its ordinary existence. A jay crossed the road ahead of me and landed in a fir and scolded something, and I watched it for a second, and then I drove on. At the bottom of the forest road, where the gravel turned to pavement, I stopped the van and sat for a moment at the transition. 9 miles of road behind me. The plains opening up ahead, the Judith Basin going wide and gold in the morning light. I thought about what Greta had said on the first afternoon, 9 miles from a pavement, and how it had felt like the right distance. It still did. It was just that I understood it differently now. Distance cuts both ways. It's the same 9 miles to get in and out, and it doesn't know the difference between you and anyone else on the road. I pulled onto the pavement and headed north toward Lewistown and the highway beyond it, and the big snowies shrank in my mirrors until they were just a low blue line on the horizon, and then the road curved and they were gone. And that's a wrap. Thank you so much for sticking around through all 4 stories, from the Beartooth Plateau to Bull Lake, the Highline Prairie to the Big Snowies. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person these stories were made for, and that genuinely means everything. If these stories kept you up a little later than you planned, made you think twice about that remote pull-off, or just gave you something worth sitting with, leave a comment and let me know. I read every single one. And if you want more van life horror, more wide-open country, more things that don't fully explain themselves, make sure you're following so you don't miss what comes next. Stay curious, camp smart, and maybe keep one eye on the tree line.